Greece was occupied by foreign armies in both world wars. This statement is not altogether true, since in the Great War, half of Greece was on the side of the Allies, who had landed at Salonika, and the other half was resolutely against them. But to claim that the possession of the Corinth Canal caused the occupation of Greece is certainly an exaggeration. It certainly did not prove to be a curse, as the Suez Canal sometimes was to its local population. Despite its long tradition of democracy, Greece had been ruled by kings since 1832, first with Otto of Wittelsbach, and then, from 1863, by the House of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg, which had taken over with George I, who ruled until his assassination by an anarchist in 1913. His eldest son succeeded him and took the title of Constantine I. His reign had auspicious beginnings as he led his armies in the Second Balkan War, which doubled Greek territory. But his popularity was soon put to the test. At the start of the Great War, Greece attempted in vain to maintain its neutrality. The new king leaned heavily towards the Central Powers, Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He could hardly be blamed for that. After all, his ancestors were Germans, and his wife, Queen Sophie, was the Kaiser's sister. But Germany had allied itself with Turkey, the hereditary enemy, and this did not go down well with the majority of Greeks. Greece had nothing to win from such an alliance. Most of her coveted territories were in Turkey. The dream of recovering Constantinople, the megali idea, great idea, was not far from every Greek politician's mind, and might only be attainable by allying themselves with the powers of the Entente. Russia and Serbia, bastions of the Orthodox faith, had allied themselves with France and Great Britain, and to fight them would have been abhorrent to the majority of Greeks. It was not surprising that a large element of the population, led by the charismatic Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, would be at odds with their king. Venizelos was unflinching in his conviction that the Western powers would prevail, and advocated an alliance which was resisted by the king. The Anglo-French ill-fated expedition in the Dardanelles and the subsequent landing at Gallipoli put a great strain on the neutrality of Greece. Nor were the Greeks indifferent to the fate of the Serbs, who were fighting the Bulgarians and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By December 15th, the Serbian army, after having put up a fierce resistance, was exhausted and in full retreat through Albania. Italy had joined the Allies' side. The French had occupied Argostoli on the island of Cephalonia to close the Adriatic and bottle up the Austrian navy. They wanted to evacuate the Serbian army to Salonika, where they had taken a foothold that previous October and were fighting Bulgaria. Political pressure was exerted to use the Corinth Canal, as the trip around the Peloponnese would expose the French transports to the threat of lurking German U-boats. This was opposed by the King of Greece. Allied heavy-handedness had begun to alienate a number of Greeks, and Prime Minister Venizelos had to resign. Prime Minister Skouloudis was appointed by King Constantine and bent on preserving Greek neutrality at all cost. He even threatened to blow up the Corinth Canal.
Flying his flag on the brand-new battleship Provence, Vice Admiral d'Artige du Fournet led an Allied squadron to Piraeus and threatened Athens with its guns. The French admiral had supervised the transfer by sea of over 100,000 Serbian troops from Corfu to Salonika around the Peloponnese, bypassing the canal. Austrian and German submarines appear to have been singularly ill-informed, as the operation was completed without a single casualty. The Allies were building up their strength in Salonika to attack Bulgaria, which was believed to be a weak ally of Germany. The French admiral had come to the conclusion that the Corinth Canal could be bypassed, and Allied troops landed instead at Itaea in the Gulf of Corinth. From there, they could be transported by railway to their destination, but this could only be done with the permission of the Greek government. At Salonika, the occupation by Allied forces had been viewed by Greeks with mixed feelings. While Republicans looked upon it favorably and were eager to join the fight on the side of France and Great Britain, the king and his partisans resented this intervention, which was seen as an infringement of Greek sovereignty. In August 1916, the gulf between Royalists and Venizelos deepened when pro-Venizelist officers staged a coup in Salonika, and soon Venizelos was at the head of a provisional government in northern Greece. This was the beginning of the Great Schism between Royalists and Republicans, and it would divide Greece for the next decades. On 1 December, Venizelos and the Salonika government declared war on Germany and Bulgaria. The next day, a mixed force of French, British, and Italian troops, numbering about 2,500 men, landed in Piraeus in the belief that it could force the king to make concessions. The Allied contingent came under heavy fire from Greek forces loyal to the king and was forced into a humiliating retreat after suffering 60 killed and 167 wounded. This would be known as the Getapen d'Athènes and sometimes referred to as the Greek Vespers. The future dictator Ioannis Metaxas was one of the royalist officers involved in this resistance, and the opportunity was taken to manhandle and jail Venizelist sympathizers in Athens. Admiral Dufournet had to be recalled to France. The success of the royalist cause was short-lived, for despite their promises of aid, the Central Powers were helpless to intervene and take advantage of the situation. Eventually, the Allied fleets, which ruled the Mediterranean, were able to exert a pressure which the seafaring Greeks were unable to resist. King Constantine I was forced to abdicate on 15 June 1917. His youngest son, Alexander, who was considered pro-Entente, replaced him. The king, Metaxas, and many royalist sympathizers were exiled. On the Salonika front, despite a long and protracted campaign, the Allied forces eventually prevailed. Bulgaria was forced to surrender, and Hungary was on the brink of collapse when the armistice intervened. Everything appeared to have justified the Venizelist action, and large chunks of territory were gained by Greece, making the Megali idea an attainable goal. But due to short memory, war weariness, or perhaps to the abuse of power that is so often seen when opposition is eliminated, the Venizelists lost the election in 2020. King Alexander had died by a freak accident, a monkey bite, and this paved the way to a return of King Constantine I. Turkey had long been described as the sick man of Europe and had hitherto survived many disastrous wars, but the Great War was to prove the death knell of the Ottoman Empire. At the time of the Italo-Turkish War of 1911 to 1912, the Italian army had occupied Libya and the Dodecanese Islands. The end of the Great War witnessed dissension among the Allies as they coveted the former Ottoman possessions. Greece had hoped to recover the Dodecanese Islands, as the majority of their population were of Greek descent, but this was to be denied at the peace conference. The islands would remain an Italian colony until the end of the Second World War. Cyprus had been ceded by Turkey to Great Britain and remained firmly in her possession. It was also known that the Italians had their eyes on Smyrna, a predominantly Greek city in Turkey. The secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 had already divided the Arab world, save for Arabia, between Great Britain and France. The Greeks also feared that the Russians might snatch Constantinople from their hands, an old dream of the Tsars. But the Russian Revolution and ensuing civil war diverted their attention at this critical time. Greece appeared to have a free hand and invaded Turkey in an ill-fated attempt to recover Anatolia. The royalist generals proved to be incompetent and were defeated by Kemal Atatürk in 1922, putting an end to the Megali idea. The new Turkish Republic recognized the Italian occupation of the Dodecanese Islands.
This defeat appeared to spell the doom of the royalist faction, with King Constantine I abdicating a second time and Venizelos returning to Greece and being elected prime minister again. To universal surprise, he achieved reconciliation with Turkey, and a massive exchange of population followed. In 1932, Venizelos lost the election as the Great Depression had deeply affected Greece. Royalists were again managing to make inroads in Greek politics. In 1935, an attempted coup by a Venizelos general Plastiras to restore the republic failed,
King George II acceded to the throne. Venizelos was forced into exile. His sympathizers were persecuted, and some of his most important supporters executed. The Greek army was purged of its republican officers. On 4th August 1936, the dictatorship of General Ioannis Metaxas was established with the king's approval, and it was patterned on Italian fascism. Yet relations between Italy and Greece had been uneasy since the Corfu incident. The rise of Italian fascism had led to expansion demands, and Italian forces briefly occupied Corfu in 1923. The island was strategically important, as it could give Italy control of the Adriatic. Pressure from the League of Nations forced the Italians to withdraw, but the incident was bitterly remembered in Greece. Greek aspirations that the Dodecanese Islands, with a predominantly Greek population, would be restored to Greece had come to naught. The advent of Nazism in Germany, with Hitler's insatiable demands and unrelenting drive to undo the Treaty of Versailles, coupled with the expansion of fascism, reflected by Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, did not bode well for the Western democracies. Their societies were uncertain if the threat from the extreme right was a lesser evil than communism. Germany had annexed Austria, and following the Munich Agreement, had occupied part of Czechoslovakia. The Spanish Civil War became a confrontation between fascism and the democracies, but the influence of the communist faction in the Spanish Republic was on the increase, with the Soviet Union openly on their side, while the Western democracies vacillated and did nothing. The forces of General Franco ultimately prevailed, thanks to an important contribution from Italy and, to a lesser extent, help from Germany. In April 1939, with the victory of fascism in Spain barely consecrated, Italian troops occupied Albania with little resistance. King Zog fled to Greece, and the country was incorporated in the Italian Empire. The presence of an Italian army across the border did nothing to reassure the Greek government. The following month, Italy joined Germany in the Pact of Steel. But the Duce had made it clear that his country would not be ready for war before 1942 or 1943. During the summer, the British and French governments attempted half-heartedly to enlist the support of the Soviet Union, in the hope that Germany might be dissuaded from invading Poland. The German-Soviet pact took everyone by surprise, and within days the invasion of Poland followed. The belief that this war could be contained quickly evaporated when Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. Italy ought to have joined Germany's side, but clearly the promise made by the Führer that Germany would not go to war before 1942 made her adherence to the Pact of Steel questionable, and she remained neutral. The Mediterranean was an oasis of peace, for the time being. British and French warships were busy hunting German merchant ships, which were scrambling to reach the nearest neutral ports. If the Corinth Canal could be used by the Germans to move from the Aegean to the more friendly ports of neutral Italy, this was not without its drawbacks. Passage of enemy ships could be easily monitored by the British or French naval attachés and reported to the contraband patrol. Interception could then be made and the ship brought to Malta or Bizerta. On the eve of the war, the canal had a yearly average of 8,600 ships of a net tonnage of 2,649,000 tons. The largest ship to have used the canal was reported to have been the passenger cargo ship King Alexander, 11,415 GRT 1997, of the M. Embericos line. But most ships using it were of small and medium sizes and serviced the Aegean. The canal was owned by the Nouvelle Société Anonyme du Canal de Corinth, with a capital of 1,750,000 drachmas and 10,000 shares with a nominal value of 25 drachmas each. The society was a private enterprise with 60% of shares held by French interests and 40% held by the National Bank of Athens. The Director General was the engineer Konstantinos Skiferas. The canal was especially beneficial for Italy. It allowed for faster communications with its Dodecanese possessions. On January 22, 1940, the Italian submarines Squalo, Santa Rosa, and Narvalo passed through the canal on their way to Leros. However, once the war started in the Mediterranean, Italian warships avoided its use for security reasons.
On 26 January 1940, an Anglo-Greek trade agreement was signed in London, with a view to limiting the trade between Greece and Germany. One of the clauses was that the United Kingdom would purchase the yearly chrome production up to a maximum of 55,000 tons. Chrome was essential for the German military industry. In addition, the Hellenic merchant fleet was the world's 7th largest, with over 500 ships, and most of these were chartered by Britain, with the Greeks heavily dependent on this source of income. The question of a naval base in the Aegean to exercise contraband control was raised. At that time, the Greek delegation was not ready to discuss the matter, as it would be a breach of their neutrality. Admiral Cunningham, commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, suggested that an anchorage might be a substitute for a base, and could be done with a ship such as HMS Van Dyck acting as a floating base. When the war with Italy started in June 1940, the oiler British Union was sent to Monemvasia, east coast of the Peloponnese, to refuel British destroyers escorting Mediterranean convoys. The Greek government requested her immediate departure, but she was just moved to another anchorage. She was finally withdrawn after she was unsuccessfully bombed by Italian aircraft on 12 July, as was the Greek destroyer Hydra, which had gone to investigate. In the eyes of the Italian government, this only fueled speculations that collusion existed between Greek and British naval authorities. The interdiction of traffic with Germany from the Black Sea was sought, especially during the winter months, when the Danube froze. For some time, Section D for demolition, of MI6 had studied the possibility of blocking the iron gates of the Danube by sabotage. If this was achieved, oil from Romania or the Soviet Union, chrome and other commodities could be prevented from reaching Germany and an increasingly hostile Italy. Only the sea route through the Bosporus, Aegean, and the Corinth Canal would be left open, and this could be disrupted by an Anglo-French contraband control. The Germans actually initiated the first naval sabotage operation in this theater when the British transport Tintern Abbey had brought 2 motorboats to Burgas to be used on the Danube by the naval attaché in Bucharest. On her return voyage, Tintern Abbey was rocked by an explosion after reaching Limni, Euroa, on 29 January 1940. The vessel required 8 days of repairs at Piraeus, where an investigation revealed that a time delay bomb had been placed in a barrel of strawberry pulp loaded at Burgas. An appropriate response had to be found. Great Britain occupied the 2 main accesses to the Mediterranean, Gibraltar to the west and the Suez Canal to the east. Although Egypt had acquired its independence since 1922, she was still under a de facto occupation by British troops. The island of Malta had a strategic position in central Mediterranean, but its proximity to Italian air bases made its survival in war questionable. Alexandria had replaced it as the home of the Mediterranean Fleet under Admiral Cunningham. France had colonies in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Syria.
By the spring of 1940, the phony war had ended with the German invasions of Denmark and Norway. A month later, it was the turn of the Low Countries, and the Battle of France had begun. Prior to this, France and Great Britain had tried to intervene in the Balkans. French General Weygand had attempted to organize a Balkan alliance. His intention was to threaten oil supplies to Germany by bombing the Baku oil fields in Soviet Russia. This folly, typical of the last days of the French Third Republic, was never implemented. The British government, more realistically, was working to form a defensive alliance of Balkan states, in particular with Greece, Turkey, and Romania. It could act as a shield to their Middle East interests. The German breakthrough at Sedan forced the recall to France of General Weygand, and the British efforts failed to crystallize. By the end of May, the Allied armies were encircled at Dunkirk, and the war seemed lost. For the Duce, the temptation was too great, and at midnight on 10 June, Italy was at war with Great Britain and France. Within 2 weeks, France had signed an armistice. The balance of power appeared to have shifted in the Mediterranean.
Paul the Apostle founded one of the earliest churches in Corinth, and it is there that he is reported to have written the 2 letters known as the Epistles to the Corinthians, which are incorporated in the New Testament. But outside Greece, the average person has never heard of the Corinth Canal, and few are aware that it was the focus of so many attempts to block it during the Second World War. History books have ignored these episodes, and none of our heroes have left a memoir. Canals have always been an asset to their country and a good source of revenue, but they can also attract the unwelcome attention of foreign powers, as they have often been strategic objectives. We are told that the origin of the Corinth Canal dates at least back to 602 BC, when Periander, tyrant of Corinth, tried digging one across the isthmus which links the Corinth and Saronic Gulfs. It separates the Peloponnese Peninsula from mainland Greece. For the navigator in the Ionian Sea, it provides a quick access to Piraeus and the Aegean. The canal allows shipping to avoid the circumnavigation of the Peloponnese and the dangerous areas around Cape Matapan and Cape Malea. Because of the cost involved, this first attempt came to naught. Periander was more successful in his construction of the diolkos, an elaborate system which allowed vessels to be dragged across over land. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, Thucydides writes that the Lacedaemonians sent 21 ships over the isthmus to help the defection of Chios from its alliance with Athens. This challenge to the Athenian naval supremacy would lead to their eventual defeat. The diolkos was an innovative concept for the times. The Corinth Canal project was undertaken at various times by kings or emperors, but the magnitude of the task proved formidable. Sutorius tells us that Emperor Nero ordered the digging of the waterway and even exhorted his Praetorian Guard to help with the project. He himself removed the first basket of earth, but his assassination interrupted the enterprise. At the end of the 19th century, modern digging equipment had overcome the obstacles of Suez and Panama, and this time the Corinth project was successfully tackled and completed in 1893. At that time, Greece had been an independent country for barely 70 years. The canal was a great achievement and a symbol of the modernization of the country after more than 3 centuries of Turkish occupation which had left it devastated and prostrate. The canal is 6,343 meters long, 3.94 miles, has a maximum width of 21.3 meters, 70 feet at seabed, and a depth of 8 meters, 26 feet. It crosses the Isthmus of Corinth, which at its highest point is 80 meters, 260 feet above sea level. Its vertical cliffs are a testimony of the power of man over nature. Even the blasé tourist of today cannot fail but be dazzled by this cleft in the isthmus. The traveler saves as much as 185 nautical miles by using it, instead of taking the route around the Peloponnese. At first glance, this seems to be dwarfed by the Suez and Panama canals, which can save thousands of miles. Yet in the Second World War, this strategic shortcut to the Aegean would take an importance disproportionate to its size.